The jungle breathed in the tropical darkness. September 12, 1942. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson pressed his ear to the night air on a narrow ridge of coral and grass, 1 mile from Henderson Field. What he heard would never leave him. The snap of twigs underfoot, metal scraping against metal, Japanese voices drifting up through the black vegetation. They weren't even trying to be quiet. 3,000 enemy soldiers were assembling below, and their confidence was absolute. Edson's force numbered 840 Marines, Raiders, paratroopers, outnumbered better than 3 to 1. The ridge where they stood represented the final elevated position before the airfield. Lose it, and Japanese artillery would rain down on the runway. The planes keeping the island alive would burn. 12,000 Marines would find themselves isolated, encircled, and destroyed. This single strip of earth would decide everything. He looked at his men through the darkness. Exhaustion lined every face. 5 weeks of continuous combat. 2 meals daily when lucky. Malaria and dysentery claimed as many as enemy bullets. Many hadn't closed their eyes in a day and a half. The humidity rotted their uniforms off their backs. Some had dropped 20 pounds since the landing. Others trembled with fever while clutching their weapons. Edson didn't speak of glory. He didn't mention country. He gave them reality. "Hold one more night," he said. "Just one more night. Hold, and we get relieved at dawn." Then the Japanese attacked. The 12 hours that followed would reshape the Pacific War. It would demolish Japanese beliefs about American resolve. It would forge the Marine Corps reputation as the most formidable ground combat force Japan would encounter. And it would fundamentally alter how the Japanese Empire approached warfare against American infantry. But understanding why this single night carried such weight requires stepping back to summer 1942. Japan wasn't just winning, it was crushing all opposition. The 6 months following Pearl Harbor saw the Imperial Japanese forces sweep across the Pacific with velocity that shocked global military observers. Hong Kong collapsed in 17 days. Singapore, the supposedly unconquerable fortress, surrendered after 70 days, with 80,000 British and Commonwealth soldiers marching into imprisonment. The largest capitulation in British military history. The Dutch East Indies crumbled in 3 months. Burma, the Philippines, Wake Island, all fallen. American and Allied forces had been defeated at every turn. Japanese military control now stretched 5,000 miles, from India's borders to the central Pacific Islands. Tokyo's analysts calculated that captured territories and populations dwarfed the home islands. Oil flowed from the Dutch East Indies. Rubber came from Malaya. Rice poured in from Indochina. The Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere was materializing before their eyes. Beyond territory, Japanese commanders had secured something equally precious. They'd convinced themselves that Western soldiers simply couldn't fight. This wasn't propaganda. Japanese officers genuinely believed it. They'd watched British forces surrender by the tens of thousands at Singapore, many without firing a round. They'd observed American forces on Bataan resist bravely, but ultimately collapse after months of starvation and illness. They'd studied their infantry's performance in China, where Japanese troops secured victory after victory against numerically superior forces through shock tactics, speed, and willingness to embrace death. The conclusion appeared self-evident. Asian soldiers possessed spiritual strength that Westerners lacked. The Bushido Code, warrior traditions stretching back centuries, gave Japanese troops an advantage no amount of American industrial output could neutralize. 1 Japanese soldier equaled 10 Americans. Officers who would gamble thousands of lives simply accepted this as established fact. Japanese military intelligence reinforced these beliefs with analyses bordering on delusion. American Marines were characterized as prison inmates offered combat as an alternative to incarceration. They were portrayed as undisciplined, inadequately trained, liable to crumble under pressure. The few thousand Marines on Guadalcanal were estimated at 2,000 men, perhaps fewer, poorly supplied, demoralized, ready for annihilation. Imperial headquarters operated on these assumptions while planning Guadalcanal's recapture. They allocated forces adequate only against the weak garrison they imagined. They never questioned whether reality might differ. This assessment was wrong in nearly every detail. And one man knew exactly how wrong. Major General Alexander Vandegrift, commanding the 1st Marine Division, harbored no illusions. His Marines had come ashore August 7th, carrying 17 days of ammunition and rations. The Navy withdrew after severe losses at Savo Island, leaving Vandegrift's force stranded on an island they barely controlled. Japanese aircraft bombed Henderson Field daily, flying down from Rabaul in seemingly endless formations. Japanese warships shelled the perimeter nightly, their 14-inch shells transforming darkness into explosions and flame. Japanese reinforcements flooded onto the island via high-speed destroyer runs, the Tokyo Express, delivering fresh troops under night's cover. Vandegrift's men were starving. They were sick. They were surrounded by an enemy growing stronger weekly while their supplies diminished. By any rational military assessment, the situation was desperate. But Vandegrift also knew something Tokyo didn't. He knew what Marines were truly capable of. These weren't criminals or draftees. Marine training consumed 13 weeks, longer than any other American service branch. Every Marine received 147 hours of rifle instruction at Parris Island, nearly triple what Army recruits got. Every Marine qualified as a rifleman before specializing in anything else. This wasn't empty rhetoric. This was operational doctrine, established after the Commandant discovered in 1899 that fewer than 100 Marines across the entire Corps could meet marksmanship standards. Major Charles Lochheimer received orders to take shooting seriously. The Corps spent 4 decades doing precisely that. By 1942, Marine marksmanship was legendary. Qualification standards that would mark an Army soldier as expert barely satisfied minimum Marine requirements. More significantly, Marines had developed something unprecedented in military organization. Since 1934, they'd trained specifically for amphibious assault, the most challenging military operation in existence. They'd written the manual on it, literally. The tentative manual for landing operations, published that year, became the foundation for amphibious doctrine not just in America, but globally. The Navy adopted it. The Army adopted it. Even the British referenced it when planning their own amphibious operations. Between 1935 and 1941, Marines conducted 7 fleet landing exercises, refining doctrine for naval gunfire support, close air support, and infantry tactics against fortified beaches. They developed specifications for landing craft capable of delivering troops directly onto hostile shores. They trained naval officers to coordinate bombardment with infantry movements. They learned through brutal trial and error what worked and what got men killed. No other military worldwide had invested this level of effort into storming defended coastlines. The Japanese were about to discover what that training produced. The first demonstration came August 21st, 2 weeks before Edson Ridge. Colonel Kayaneo Ichiki led 917 elite Japanese soldiers across a sandbar at the Ilu River mouth, misidentified on American maps as the Tenaru. These were China campaign veterans, hardened troops who'd never tasted defeat. Ichiki himself was a decorated officer with years of combat experience. His regiment had participated in Guam's conquest. They expected to break through American lines in a single night. They attacked after dark, screaming, bayonets fixed, absolutely certain they'd shatter the Marines as they'd shattered every previous enemy. The Marines were waiting. They dug in along the river's west bank. Machine guns covered the sandbar from multiple angles. Riflemen had registered their weapons on probable crossing points during daylight. Barbed wire stretched across approaches. The position wasn't elaborate, but it was prepared. When Ichiki's men charged across the sandbar in darkness, machine guns opened from 3 directions. Tracers sliced through the packed formations. Riflemen fired with accuracy that hundreds of range hours had burned into muscle memory. The Japanese charge hit a wall of fire and disintegrated. Wave after wave came forward. Wave after wave was destroyed. Bodies accumulated on the sandbar until following Japanese had to climb over their own dead. By dawn, the carnage was complete. M3 Stuart light tanks from the 1st Tank Battalion rolled through the coconut grove where surviving Japanese had retreated, finishing the destruction. Marines counted over 800 dead Japanese soldiers on the sandbar and in the surrounding jungle. Colonel Ichiki burned his regimental colors to prevent capture, then shot himself. American losses, 35 killed. When reports reached Tokyo, staff officers refused to believe them. The numbers had to be incorrect. Japanese soldiers didn't die in such ratios. It wasn't possible. But it was possible. And it was about to happen again. The Tenaru defeat was attributed to Ichiki's overconfidence. He divided his force, attacking with only half his regiment while the rest stayed behind. Tokyo reasoned that a stronger force, properly coordinated, would succeed where Ichiki failed. Major General Kyote Kawaguchi brought 3,000 men through the jungle to attack from the south, avoiding the coastal areas where Ichiki had been annihilated. His route took weeks to traverse, with soldiers hacking through tropical vegetation so dense that progress sometimes slowed to a few hundred yards daily. Many collapsed from exhaustion and disease before reaching assault positions. His plan was sound. His troops were fresher compared to the Marines they'd face. And he'd chosen as his target the ridge where Lieutenant Colonel Edson waited with his 840 raiders. Edson understood what was coming. Intelligence had detected Japanese movement in the jungle. Coast watchers had reported the Tokyo Express delivering reinforcements. The ridge 1 mile south of Henderson Field was the obvious approach for any force attempting to reach the airfield through jungle. Edson positioned his men carefully. The 1st Raider Battalion and 1st Parachute Battalion spread across a line roughly 1,000 yards long. They dug fighting holes in the rocky coral soil. They cleared fields of fire through the kunai grass. They registered artillery coordinates on likely approach routes. And they waited. The assault began at 9:30 p.m. on September 12th, with a Japanese cruiser and 3 destroyers shelling Marine positions. Shells crashed into the ridge, sending coral fragments spinning through darkness. As the bombardment lifted, the first waves emerged from the jungle. What followed was 12 hours of combat, so intense that veterans struggled to describe it for the rest of their lives. The Japanese attacked in waves, throwing themselves at Marine lines through waist-high kunai grass. Officers led with drawn swords, screaming commands. Enlisted men followed with fixed bayonets, some firing as they ran, others saving bullets for close quarters. Grenades arced through darkness, their explosions punctuating the continuous roar of rifle fire. Machine guns fired until barrels glowed red, gunners pouring water on mechanisms to keep them functioning. Marines fought with bayonets when ammunition ran low, with knives when bayonets broke, with entrenching tools and bare hands when nothing else remained. The fighting was so close men could smell their enemies, so dark that friend and foe were distinguished only by shape and sound. The center of the Marine line buckled. A paratrooper company was nearly overrun, its commander killed. Survivors falling back in confusion. Japanese soldiers penetrated to within 1,000 yards of Henderson Field. Some reached the airstrip's edge before being killed. Edson was everywhere. Standing on an ammunition box in full view of the enemy, silhouetted against artillery flashes, he directed fire, repositioned units, and rallied men close to breaking. His nickname was Red Mike, earned from a beard he'd worn in Nicaragua. That night, he earned something more valuable. He earned the Medal of Honor. At one point, with the line collapsing and Japanese forces pouring through the gap, Edson encountered Marines falling back in disorder. "Where are you going?" he demanded. "We can't hold them," came the reply. Edson's response became legend. "By God, you will hold. Now get back there and do it." They held. By 3 a.m. on September 14th, the crisis peaked. Japanese forces had punched through the center and were pouring toward the airfield. Edson had committed every reserve. Nothing remained. The situation had reached the point where Major General Vandergrift, waiting at his command post, later admitted it was the only time during the entire Guadalcanal campaign he doubted the outcome. Then artillery arrived. The 11th Marines had registered their guns on the ridge during daylight. Now in darkness, they fired mission after mission onto Japanese assault columns. 105 mm shells tore through packed formations with devastating effect. Shrapnel sighed through men advancing shoulder to shoulder. Blast waves threw bodies through the air. The jungle erupted in continuous explosions that turned approach routes into killing grounds. The Japanese advance stalled, then fragmented, then broke entirely. Dawn revealed the victory scale. Over 600 Japanese bodies lay on the ridge and in the jungle below. Some counts reached 800. Wounded Japanese soldiers had been dragged back into the jungle by comrades, meaning the actual toll was probably higher still. Marine casualties were under 200 with fewer than 60 killed. Kawaguchi retreated into the jungle with his brigade's remnants. Many would die of starvation and disease in the weeks ahead, unable to be resupplied, unable to be evacuated. He'd started with 3,000 men. He would emerge months later with a fraction of that number. The Battle of Edson Ridge, later called Bloody Ridge, was over. One word spread through both armies after that night. Among the Marines, it was simple. They had held against 3-to-1 odds in darkness, with everything at stake. They had held. It was exactly what their training had prepared them to do. Among the Japanese, the word was different. It was confusion. It was doubt. For the first time, Japanese soldiers had thrown themselves against an American position with everything they had, and they'd been slaughtered. Second Lieutenant Genjiro Inui, an officer with the 8th Independent Anti-Tank Gun Company, recorded his thoughts in a diary that would survive the war. He'd witnessed the aftermath of both Tenaru and Edson Ridge. He'd seen the bodies piled on the sandbar. He'd heard survivors describe machine gun fire that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Their firepower had overwhelmed us, he wrote. We had put too much confidence in our charging power. Only after our superior firepower can compete with their superior firepower will the charging power of the Imperial Army win a victory. This wasn't propaganda for home consumption. This was a professional soldier's private assessment, never intended for anyone else's eyes, and it captured something profound. The Japanese were beginning to understand that their assumptions about American infantry were catastrophically wrong. Inui noted another revelation in his diary, one that challenged everything Tokyo believed about Marine strength. Based on the wishful thinking by the Imperial headquarters that the United States Marine Corps were about 2,000 or so, he wrote, Ichiki's force was divided up and dispatched to Guadalcanal with small arms. The reality was that 12,000 Marines held the island. Japanese intelligence had been wrong by a factor of 6. But understanding came slowly. Tokyo wasn't ready to accept that its soldiers were being outfought by men they'd dismissed as soft and undisciplined. More troops were sent. More attacks were ordered. More bodies piled up on Guadalcanal. The battle for Henderson Field in late October brought 20,000 Japanese soldiers against the Marine perimeter in the campaign's largest ground assault. Lieutenant General Harakichi Hyakutake, commanding the 17th Army, personally directed the operation. Japanese battleships bombarded the airfield with 14-inch shells on the nights of October 13th and 14th, destroying half the Marine aviation fuel and dozens of aircraft. Japanese soldiers attacked from multiple directions simultaneously, coordinating their assaults through jungle in an operation far more sophisticated than anything previously attempted. The Marines held again. Over 3 days of combat, the Japanese suffered approximately 3,500 dead. American losses were under 300. The pattern established at Tenaru and Edson Ridge was repeating itself across the entire perimeter. Japanese attacks were being shattered against Marine firepower with kill ratios that defied everything Tokyo believed about infantry combat. By February 1943, the Japanese evacuated Guadalcanal. They'd landed approximately 36,000 troops on the island. Over 6 months of desperate fighting, they'd lost between 20 and 30,000 killed, with thousands more dead from disease and starvation. Marine and Army ground forces together had lost around 1,600 killed in action. The myth of Japanese military invincibility died on Guadalcanal. It died on the sandbar at Tenaru. It died on Edson Ridge. It died in the mud and jungle around Henderson Field. And Japanese commanders knew it. What Tokyo understood, and what took the rest of the world longer to grasp, was that Guadalcanal wasn't a fluke. The Marines had developed a fighting method that the Japanese couldn't match. It combined rifle marksmanship, small unit tactics, and devastating supporting fires into a system that chewed through bonsai charges like a meat grinder. The key innovation was the fire team structure Marines had developed in the pre-war years. Captain Evans Carlson had observed Mao Zedong's 8th Route Army in China and brought back ideas about small unit organization that the Corps adapted for its purposes. By January 1944, Marine infantry squads consisted of 13 men organized into 3 fire teams of 4 men each. Each fire team contained a leader, an automatic rifleman carrying the Browning automatic rifle, an assistant automatic rifleman, and a rifleman. This meant 3 automatic weapons per squad. Army squads of the same period carried only 1 Browning automatic rifle. Marines could generate 3 times the automatic weapons fire at the squad level, the basic building block of infantry combat. The difference mattered. In close-range fighting that characterized Pacific Island combat, concentrated automatic fire was decisive. A Marine squad could suppress an enemy position while maneuvering against it, using 1 fire team to pin the enemy and 2 to attack from different angles. This flexibility had been designed for amphibious assault, where units often landed fragmented and had to operate independently. It proved equally valuable in jungle warfare, where larger formations could maintain cohesion. The war in the Pacific had changed. The question was whether Japan could adapt. The answer came over the next 3 years, written in blood across islands whose names would become synonymous with Marine sacrifice. Tarawa, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Each campaign demanded more than the last. Each forced both sides to evolve. At Tarawa in November 1943, the 2nd Marine Division assaulted BDO Island, a fortress of concrete bunkers and coconut log barriers defended by nearly 5,000 elite Japanese naval infantry. Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki, the Japanese commander, had built what he considered an impregnable position. Every approach was covered by interlocking fields of fire. Underwater obstacles blocked landing craft. Heavy guns could reach any point where invaders might land. Shibasaki boasted that 1 million men couldn't take Tarawa in 100 years. The Marines took it in 76 hours. The cost was appalling. Nearly 1,000 Marines died, many wading hundreds of yards through chest-deep water under machine gun fire because their landing craft couldn't clear the coral reef. A rare tidal condition called an apogeian neap tide had reduced water depth over the reef to barely 3 feet, grounding Higgins boats that needed 4 feet to pass. Only the LVT amphibian tractors could cross. Everyone else had to wade. More than 2,000 additional Marines were wounded. The beaches were littered with bodies. But when it finished, only 17 Japanese soldiers from the original garrison had survived to surrender. That meant 4,500 Japanese had been killed in 3 days of combat on an island smaller than Central Park. Shibasaki himself died on the 2nd day, killed by naval gunfire from American destroyers when he attempted moving his command post. His prediction about 1 million men and 100 years had been proven wrong by 18,000 Marines and 76 hours. Colonel David Shoup, who commanded the assault and continued directing operations for 36 hours after being wounded in both legs by shrapnel, received the Medal of Honor. First Lieutenant William Hawkins earned the Medal of Honor posthumously for single-handedly destroying multiple pillboxes on the first day. Shoup himself said it wasn't often you could credit a first lieutenant with winning a battle, but Hawkins came as near to it as any man could. Colonel Merritt Edson, now serving as Division Chief of Staff, came ashore to assess the situation and later observed that Marines had paid the stiffest price in human life per square yard at Tarawa than any other battle in Corps history. For Medals of Honor total were awarded for Tarawa. The battle shocked the American public when casualty footage reached home, but it proved fortified islands could be taken by direct assault. And it taught lessons that would save lives in campaigns to come. At Peleliu in September 1944, the Japanese unveiled a new defensive doctrine that would make Guadalcanal's banzai charges seem almost merciful in retrospect. Colonel Kunio Nakagawa commanded roughly 11,000 defenders on an island of coral ridges and natural caves. Rather than waste men in frontal assaults, Nakagawa placed only a single battalion as a delaying force on the beaches. His main strength hid in more than 500 caves carved into the Ymerburgal ridges, which Marines would come to call Bloody Nose Ridge. Major General William Rupertus, commanding the 1st Marine Division, predicted a rough but fast battle lasting perhaps 4 days. It lasted 73 days. The 1st Marine Regiment suffered such catastrophic casualties it was rendered combat ineffective and had to be withdrawn. Some rifle companies lost over 60% of their men in the first week. The tactics that had worked at Guadalcanal and Tarawa, suppressing enemy positions then destroying them, failed against defenders who refused to show themselves until Marines were within grenade range. Nakagawa held out until November, sending his final message on November 24th. "Our sword is broken and we have run out of spears," he reported. Then he burned his regimental colors and committed ritual suicide. He was posthumously promoted to lieutenant general. American casualties at Peleliu exceeded 8,000, including more than 1,500 killed. Japanese losses approached 11,000, with only a handful surviving to become prisoners. The lessons of Peleliu spread through both militaries. The Japanese had found a way to multiply their defenders' effectiveness. The Marines had found that their existing tactics were no longer sufficient. Both would apply what they learned to battles still to come. By 1944, Japanese military doctrine was undergoing fundamental transformation. The lesson of Guadalcanal, confirmed at Tarawa, could no longer be ignored. American Marines weren't soft. They weren't undisciplined. They weren't going to break under pressure. Banzai charges, the massed infantry assaults that had worked in China and across Southeast Asia, were simply feeding men into a killing machine. Lieutenant General Tadamaki Kurabayashi was perhaps the first Japanese commander to fully absorb this lesson and act on it. Assigned to defend Iwo Jima in June 1944, Kurabayashi brought unusual qualifications to the task. He'd spent time in the United States from 1928 to 1930, traveling extensively across America. He'd visited Detroit and observed American industrial capacity. He'd studied American military thinking. He understood his enemy in ways few Japanese officers did. More importantly, Kurabayashi had studied Tarawa with professional intensity. He knew that clinging to the myth that American infantry had no stomach for close combat was, in his own words, foolhardy. The Marines had overwhelmed a heavily fortified special naval landing force in 3 days. They'd waded through fire that should have stopped them cold. They'd taken casualties that should have broken them and kept attacking anyway. Kurabayashi concluded that everything about Japanese defensive doctrine needed to change. No more beach defenses. Marine naval gunfire and air support made coastal fortifications death traps. Positions on the beach would be destroyed before the enemy even landed. The defenders would pull back inland into caves and tunnels where American firepower couldn't reach them. No more banzai charges. Every soldier who died in a pointless frontal assault was a soldier who couldn't kill more Americans later. The goal wasn't glorious death. It was making the enemy pay in blood for every yard of ground. Defense in depth, mutually supporting positions, forcing the Marines to fight for everything. Kurabayashi spent months transforming Iwo Jima into a fortress. His engineers carved 11 miles of tunnels into the volcanic rock. They built more than 700 pillboxes and gun positions, many connected by underground passages. They positioned artillery and mortars to cover every beach, every likely landing zone, every avenue of approach inland. The island's geography helped. Mount Suribachi dominated the southern beaches. The Motoyama Plateau in the center provided elevation for observation and fire. Natural ravines and rock formations created ready-made defensive positions. But Kuribayashi's real innovation was psychological. He told his men they would die on Iwo Jima. There would be no relief, no evacuation, no surrender. Their mission was simple: kill 10 Americans before dying yourself. Make the enemy bleed so badly that taking the next island becomes politically impossible. 21,000 Japanese defenders dug into Iwo Jima and waited. The Marines came on February 19, 1945. The 4th and 5th Marine Divisions hit the beaches in a landing that initially seemed almost easy. The volcanic sand slowed movement, but Japanese fire was lighter than expected. Some Marines thought the pre-invasion bombardment had been more effective than anyone dared hope. They were wrong. Kuribayashi had ordered his men to hold fire during the initial landings, letting the beaches pack with men and equipment before triggering the trap. When Japanese guns opened up, they did so with devastating effect. Mortars and artillery rained down on beaches crowded with Marines. Machine guns swept predetermined fields of fire. The black volcanic sand that had seemed merely inconvenient became a nightmare. Vehicles bogged down, wounded men couldn't be evacuated, ammunition and supplies piled up in killing zones. The Marines pushed inland anyway, because that's what Marines did. But every yard was purchased with blood. Every pillbox had to be attacked individually. Flamethrowers became essential weapons. Tanks moved forward to blast cave entrances with 75mm shells at point-blank range. Engineers sealed caves with demolitions, only to have defenders emerge from connecting tunnels hours later. The fighting was brutal beyond description. Marines cleared positions during the day only to have Japanese emerge from tunnels at night to reoccupy them. Artillery coordinates that had been registered became useless as defenders shifted through their underground network. The smell of death permeated the island, decomposing bodies, cordite, sulfur from the volcanic soil. Mount Suribachi fell on the 4th day. The iconic flag raising on February 23rd provided a moment of symbolic victory that would become one of the most famous photographs in military history. But the bloodiest fighting still lay ahead. The Motoyama Plateau became a killing ground. The Central Ridge System, the amphitheater, places whose names would haunt survivors. Everyone demanded its price in Marine dead and wounded. Units that had fought since Guadalcanal found themselves reduced to combat ineffective strength. Replacements arrived and died before learning their squadmates' names. The battle that had been predicted to last perhaps 5 days stretched into weeks. The 4th and 5th Marine Divisions were joined by the 3rd Marine Division, committed from reserve when casualties mounted beyond projections. Still, the Japanese fought from their caves and tunnels, making the Marines pay for every position. By the time organized resistance ended on March 26th, over 36 days after the initial landing, American casualties exceeded 26,000. Nearly 7,000 Marines had been killed. 27 Medals of Honor were awarded for Iwo Jima, more than for any other battle in American history. 13 of them were posthumous. Japanese losses were nearly total. Of the 21,000 defenders, fewer than 200 survived to become prisoners. The rest died in their tunnels, in their pillboxes, in suicide charges when ammunition ran out. Kuribayashi himself died sometime in late March. His body was never identified. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet, later observed that on Iwo Jima, uncommon valor was a common virtue. It was perhaps the highest compliment ever paid to the Marines who fought there. But it also represented something else. It showed how far Japanese defensive doctrine had evolved since Guadalcanal. The banzai charges that had failed so catastrophically in 1942 had been replaced by defense in depth that maximized every defender's effectiveness. The Japanese had learned their lesson. The question was whether it would matter. Okinawa provided the answer. The battle that began on April 1, 1945, would become the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific War. It would last 82 days. It would cost more American casualties than any other campaign in the theater. And it would demonstrate that even the most sophisticated Japanese defensive doctrine couldn't stop the Marines when supported by overwhelming American resources. Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima commanded more than 100,000 Japanese defenders on Okinawa, including the elite 32nd Army. He'd studied Iwo Jima carefully. He knew what Kurabayashi had accomplished. He knew what worked and what didn't. Ushijima abandoned the beaches entirely, pulling his forces inland to a series of defensive lines anchored on ridges and escarpments running across the island's southern portion. The Shuri Line, the Yejidake Escarpment, names that would become synonymous with some of the bloodiest fighting of the war. The initial landings were almost unopposed. Marines and Army troops poured ashore expecting resistance that never materialized. Some joked about it being an April Fool's gift. They weren't laughing for long. As American forces pushed south, they ran into defenses that made Iwo Jima look simple by comparison. The terrain itself was a fortress. Caves, tombs, ridges, ravines, all turned into mutually supporting strongpoints. Rain turned the landscape into clinging mud that swallowed vehicles and men. Japanese artillery, hidden in caves, rained shells on American positions with impunity. The fighting devolved into a brutal, slugging match. Units measured progress in yards per day. The same ridges changed hands multiple times. Places like Hacksaw Ridge, Sugarloaf Hill, and Half Moon Hill became legendary for the intensity of combat they demanded. Private First Class Desmond Doss, a conscientious objector serving as a combat medic, earned the Medal of Honor on Hacksaw Ridge by single-handedly lowering 75 wounded men down a cliff face under fire after his unit was driven back. He refused to carry a weapon on religious grounds, but repeatedly returned into the kill zone to retrieve wounded Marines and soldiers. His story would eventually become a movie, but no film could fully capture what it meant to repeatedly climb that cliff while Japanese soldiers tried to kill you. The Marines employed every lesson learned since Guadalcanal. Fire teams maneuvered with practiced efficiency. Supporting arms, artillery, naval gunfire, close air support were coordinated with precision. Flamethrower tanks burned out cave after cave. Engineers blasted sealed positions. The system that had been refined over 3 years of island warfare functioned as designed. But the cost was staggering. By the time organized resistance ended on June 21st, American casualties exceeded 48,000, including over 12,000 killed. The 10th Army, which included both Marine and Army divisions, was bled white. Some rifle companies were down to a handful of effectives. Japanese losses approached their entire garrison. Over 100,000 Japanese soldiers and Okinawan conscripts died. Perhaps 20,000 civilians perished in the crossfire and chaos. Ushijima and his chief of staff committed suicide in their final command post as American forces closed in. The battles of 1945 proved that Japanese defensive doctrine had evolved significantly since 1942. The banzai charges of Guadalcanal had given way to sophisticated defense in depth that maximized casualties even in defeat. But they also proved that it didn't matter. American industrial might, combined with Marine tactical excellence, was overwhelming. For every Japanese innovation in defense, there was an American answer. More artillery, more ammunition, more tanks, more flamethrowers, more replacements. The math was brutal and simple. America could sustain losses that would break the Japanese ability to resist. Looking back from Okinawa to Guadalcanal reveals the arc of the Pacific War. In 1942, Japanese commanders believed their soldiers were inherently superior to American infantry. They believed banzai charges would break Marine lines. They believed spiritual strength trumped firepower. Edson Ridge shattered those beliefs. The night of September 12th to 13th, 1942, demonstrated that Marines wouldn't break under pressure. That American firepower, properly applied, was devastating. That Marine training and organization produced infantry as good as any in the world. The Japanese adapted. They learned. They evolved their tactics from suicidal charges to defense in depth. They made the Marines pay a terrible price for every island. But adaptation wasn't enough. The Marines adapted faster. They refined their fire team tactics. They improved their combined arms coordination. They learned to reduce fortified positions with brutal efficiency. And behind them stood American industrial capacity that could replace losses the Japanese couldn't match. The transformation that began on Guadalcanal reached its culmination on Okinawa. The Japanese had gone from believing one of their soldiers equaled 10 Americans to making individual Japanese soldiers as deadly as possible in defense. The Marines had gone from proving they could hold against desperate attacks to demonstrating they could assault the most sophisticated defenses ever constructed. Neither side was the same force that had fought in the jungle around Henderson Field. But the fundamental lesson remained unchanged. American Marines, properly trained and equipped, were the finest infantry force Japan would ever face. That lesson was written first on a coral ridge 1 mile south of Henderson Field, on a night in September 1942 when 840 Marines held against 3,000 Japanese soldiers and refused to break. Everything that followed, Tarawa, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, was an extension of what Edson and his raiders proved that night. When push came to shove, when everything was on the line, when the odds were against them and retreat meant disaster, Marines would hold. They always had. They always would. That was the transformation that began on Edson's Ridge. Not just a change in Japanese perceptions, but a forging of Marine identity. An identity built on nights like September 12th, when men who should have been overwhelmed instead stood their ground and won. 3 years later, standing in the ruins of Okinawa, that identity was unquestioned. The Marines had proven it on island after island, battle after battle, ridge after ridge. They had paid for it in blood and sacrifice that few could fully comprehend. But they had proven it absolutely. And it had all started on a dark ridge in the Solomon Islands, when Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson told his men to hold one more night. They held. And in holding, they changed everything.